right, everyone, welcome in. We're diving deep today into something pretty interesting, a chapter straight out of Project 2025.
Yeah, this document's basically a roadmap, a conservative one, for how they envision the EPA.
The EPA, huh? So we're talking potential changes, the real deal, not just some theoretical stuff, right?
Right.
Businesses, communities, even like everyday life kind of stuff.
Absolutely gets into the nitty-gritty, like how the EPA uses science, what standards we set for air quality, the whole shebang.
Sounds like a big deal then. This Project 2025 thing, what's the gist? What are they saying about the EPA?
Well, they kick things off by arguing that, especially under Democratic administrations, the EPA's gotten too big for its britches. Like it's gone beyond what Congress originally intended.
Interesting. So too much power, is that what they're saying?
Pretty much, yeah. They even point to the EPA's budget request back in 23, claiming it was the highest ever.
Whoa, highest ever. That's got to be saying something.
Right. They highlight the increases in funding and staffing, like it's proof the EPA's gotten out of control.
So what's the solution then? What do they propose?
Well, they throw around this term right-sizing, basically scaling back the EPA.
Right sizing, huh? What would that even look like? What are they talking about specifically?
One of their big ideas is shifting more power back to the states.
States' rights kind of thing?
Yeah, you can say that. They call it cooperative federalism.
Yeah.
The idea is that states should have more say in environmental decisions instead of everything coming from the federal government.
Okay, so less top down, more bottom up. I can kind of see the appeal of that, more local control and all.
Right. The argument is that states can tailor environmental policies better to their own needs and challenges instead of a one-size-fits-all approach.
I guess that makes sense. But wouldn't that lead to like a patchwork of different regulations all over the country?
That's exactly the concern some people have, yeah. Critics argue that a state-led approach could actually weaken environmental protections overall.
So like a race to the bottom almost. States competing to have the least regulations to attract businesses.
That's the worry, yeah. And it could create confusion for companies that operate in multiple states. Imagine having to deal with 50 different sets of rules.
Yikes. Yeah, that sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Right. And then there's the issue of pollution that crosses state lines.
Wow.
How do you enforce regulations when a river flows through multiple states, for example?
Okay, yeah, that gets complicated. So it sounds like there are pros and cons to this whole states' rights idea.
Definitely. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. And it's one of the most controversial aspects of this whole Project 2025 thing.
Fascinating. So this document, it's not all just vague ideas about cooperative federalism, right? They get into specifics about what they'd actually change.
Oh, yeah. They lay out proposals for different EPA offices. Like, take the Office of Air and Radiation, for instance.
Air and radiation, that sounds important. What do they want to change there?
Well, one of their big targets is the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases.
Greenhouse gases, those are the main culprits behind climate change, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this proposal could have huge implications for all sorts of regulations, from power plants to cars, you name it.
Whoa, so we're talking about potentially loosening restrictions on emissions. That's pretty major.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And it shows how this document isn't just about abstract policy debates. It could have real-world consequences for how we address climate change.
Makes sense. So they're going after greenhouse gas regulations. What other specific changes are they proposing?
Well, in the Office of Water, they're talking about redefining what qualifies as a water of the United States.
Water of the United States, huh? Sounds kind of technical.
It is, but it's a really important issue. It basically determines which bodies of water are subject to federal regulations under the Clean Water Act.
Ah, the Clean Water Act. That's the one that keeps our rivers and lakes clean, right?
That's the one. And the current definition is pretty broad, including things like wetlands and small streams. Some folks argue that gives the EPA way too much power.
So they want to narrow the definition. Give more control back to the states, I'm guessing.
Exactly. But it's controversial, to say the least. It could have big implications for landowners, developers, and the overall health of our waterways.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a hot-button issue. So air and radiation, water. What other EPA offices are they targeting?
Well, there's also the Office of Land and Emergency Management.
Land and emergency management, what's that all about?
They're talking about streamlining the Superfund cleanup process, for one thing.
Superfund, that's the program that deals with, like, toxic waste sites, right?
You got it. Think Love Canal, those kind of situations.
Yeah, not exactly the kind of place you want to live next door to.
Right. But this document argues that the current Superfund process is too slow and burdensome. They want to speed things up.
Speed things up, huh? I mean, cleaning up toxic waste seems pretty important. Are they suggesting we cut corners to make it faster?
Well, That's the concern some people have. But they argue that the current process is just too inefficient, and we need to find ways to make it more effective.
Okay, I guess I can see both sides of that. So, Superfund cleanups, anything else on their agenda for land and emergency management?
Yeah, they also talk about changing how the EPA handles emerging contaminants, things like PFAS.
PFAS, those are those forever chemicals that are showing up everywhere, right?
Yep, those are the ones. They're a big problem, and this document suggests the EPA needs a new approach to dealing with them.
So they're saying the EPA is not doing enough.
It's more nuanced than that. They're basically saying the EPA's approach is too focused on potential risks, even if the science isn't totally settled.
So, like, they're worried about regulations being based on what might happen instead of what we know for sure is harmful.
Exactly. They argue that the EPA sometimes overreacts
Mm-hmm.
and that this stifles economic growth. They want regulations to be based on what they see as sound scientific evidence of actual harm.
So, basically, don't worry about it unless we're absolutely sure it's dangerous. Doesn't that seem a bit risky?
Well, it's a matter of perspective, right? They believe that the EPA's current approach is too precautionary. They're too quick to regulate things, even if the scientific evidence isn't rock solid.
Okay, so it's about how much risk we're willing to tolerate, I guess, and who gets to decide what level of risk is acceptable.
Exactly. It's a tough question. And this Project 2025 document definitely pushes back against the idea that we should always err on the side of caution.
Interesting. So they're advocating for a more, let's say, relaxed approach to environmental regulation.
You could put it that way, yeah. They believe the EPA should be more focused on promoting economic growth and less focused on what they see as speculative risks.
I see. But that raises another question. How do we ensure that the science being used to make these decisions is actually sound? I mean, who gets to be the arbiter of that?
That's a key point, and it leads us to another area where this document gets really interesting. Their critique of the EPA's scientific practices.
Oh, right. You mentioned earlier they had some issues with how the EPA evaluates risks, especially with chemicals.
Exactly. They specifically take aim at the Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS.
Iris, huh? What's that all about?
It's basically a database the EPA uses to assess the health risks of various chemicals.
Sounds important. Why are they criticizing it?
Well, they argue that IRIS lacks transparency and that some of the scientific assessments are outdated or unreliable.
So they're saying the EPA is basing regulations on shaky science.
That's their claim, yeah. And they even call for allowing the public to directly challenge the EPA's scientific work.
Whoa, the public. Wouldn't that just open the door to a bunch of misinformation and conspiracy theories?
That's one concern, for sure. But they argue that the current system gives too much power to unelected bureaucrats, and that the public deserves more say in how these decisions are made.
Wow, this is getting really interesting and honestly a bit concerning.
It definitely raises some big questions about the role of science in policymaking and who gets to decide what constitutes sound science.
No kidding. So folks listening, this means the very way the EPA evaluates the safety of the products we use, the air we breathe, the water we drink, could be fundamentally changed.
You got it. And we've only just scratched the surface here. There's a lot more to unpack in this document.
This is fascinating stuff. We've covered a lot of ground already, but I feel like we're just getting started.
Absolutely. There's still so much to explore, especially when it comes to their proposals for the American Indian Office and their thoughts on the legal landscape surrounding all these potential changes.
Can't wait to dive into that. This Project 2025 thing is really making us think, and hopefully it's got our listeners' minds buzzing too.
It's definitely a thought-provoking document, that's for sure. And it gives us a glimpse into a potential future for the EPA that's quite different from what we have today.
Well said. Stay tuned, everyone, because we're about to go even deeper into this fascinating and, let's be honest, kind of controversial vision for the EPA. Okay, so we're back and ready to keep digging into Project 2025. We've seen how they want to shake things up at the EPA, but now let's get into the nitty-gritty. Like, they keep talking about shifting power to the states.
Yeah, this cooperative federalism thing, it's a big part of their whole philosophy.
Right, but I still have some questions, like what's to stop a state from just saying, hey, we have the lowest environmental standards, come do business here.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that just be a race to the bottom?
That's a valid concern, definitely. But the folks who support this idea, they argue that states actually have a big incentive to protect their environment.
Oh, so?
Well, they got to live with the consequences, right?
Yeah.
If they mess up their own environment, it's their citizens who suffer.
I guess that makes sense. But what about pollution that, like, crosses state lines? What if one state pollutes a river that flows into another state? Wouldn't we need a strong EPA to step in and sort that out?
Absolutely. That's a big challenge of this whole idea. Critics worry that it would be way harder to deal with those kinds of problems without a strong federal authority.
Right. Imagine trying to get 50 different states to agree on something like air pollution standards. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it could easily turn into a bureaucratic nightmare. So there are definitely two sides to this coin. More local control could make regulations more relevant to specific regions, but it could also weaken overall protections and create a lot of confusion.
Makes sense. And let's not forget about the impact on businesses.
Right. Some industries might love having fewer federal regulations, but others might find it really hard to deal with a patchwork of state rules.
Imagine being a company that uses certain chemicals in their products. If each state has a different standard for those chemicals, it could be a logistical nightmare.
Exactly. Suddenly they got to jump through 50 different loops just to do business across state lines. That could stifle innovation and make everything way more complicated.
So it sounds like this whole state control thing is a bit of a mixed bag, to say the least.
For sure, there are potential benefits and drawbacks, and it's something that needs to be carefully considered.
Okay, so we've talked about states' rights, but let's shift gears a bit. What about their critique of the EPA's use of science? They seem to have some pretty strong opinions on that.
Yeah, they're especially critical of this thing called the precautionary principle.
Precautionary principle? What's that?
Basically, it's the idea that it's better to be safe than sorry, especially when it comes to the environment. Like if there's a chance something could be harmful, even if we don't have absolute proof, we should take steps to avoid it.
That seems reasonable. Why are they against that?
They argue that it leads to too much regulation too quickly. Like they say the EPA is too quick to jump the gun and regulate things, even if the scientific evidence isn't rock solid.
But isn't it better to err on the side of caution, especially when we're talking about things that could impact public health?
That's the argument, right? Like, what if we wait too long and then find out later that something is really dangerous? The damage might already be done.
Exactly. It feels like we're playing with fire a bit if we just ignore potential risks until we're absolutely certain they're real.
That's a valid point.
Uh-huh.
But they think the EPA goes too far with this precautionary approach. They say it stifles innovation and economic growth, all based on what might happen, not what we know for sure is happening.
So it's a balancing act, I guess. Trying to find the right level of precaution without over-regulating and hindering progress.
Right. And it's a tough balance to strike. This document definitely pushes for a more wait-and-see approach, which some people find concerning.
I can see why. So they're basically questioning the whole foundation of how the EPA operates.
In a way, yeah. They're advocating for a more, let's say, cautious approach to regulation. Like, only regulate things when we have definitive proof they're harmful.
That's a pretty big shift in thinking, and it raises some important questions, like who gets to decide what constitutes definitive proof when it comes to something like pollution?
Right, that's a key point. It's not always black and white, and there's often a lot of uncertainty in science.
Especially when we're dealing with things like long-term exposure to chemicals, the effects might not be immediately obvious.
Exactly, so it's a tricky situation. This document argues that the EPA needs to be more careful about how they use science, that they shouldn't be regulating things based on what might be harmful, but only on what we know for sure is harmful.
Okay, but then the question becomes, how do we make sure the science being used to make these decisions is actually sound? Who gets to be the judge of that?
That's a great question, and it leads us back to their critique of IRIS, the EPA's system for evaluating the risks of chemicals.
Right. They had some issues with that, if I remember correctly. Something about transparency.
Yeah, they argue that IRIS is too opaque, that the public doesn't have enough insight into how these risk assessments are being done.
So they're worried about a lack of transparency and accountability.
Exactly. And they also claim that some of the science being used in IRIS is outdated or unreliable.
So they're basically saying that the EPA is making decisions based on bad science.
That's the gist of it, yeah. They even suggest that the public should be able to directly challenge the EPA's scientific work.
Wow, that seems like opening a can of worms. Wouldn't that just lead to a bunch of misinformation and politically motivated attacks on science?
It's a valid concern, for sure, but they argue that the current system gives too much power to unelected scientists and bureaucrats, and that the public deserves more say in how these decisions are made.
Okay, so it's not just about the science itself. It's about who gets to control the science and how it's used to create policy.
Exactly. It's about power, transparency, and ultimately trust. Like, who do we trust to make these important decisions about our environment?
That's a big question, and it's not one with an easy answer. So we've got this tension between states' rights, scientific uncertainty, and this push for more transparency.
It's a complex web, that's for sure. And it's fascinating to see how this document tries to weave all those threads together.
It is, and they don't shy away from controversy either. Like, they even propose some changes to how the EPA interacts with Native American tribes.
Yeah, that one caught my eye too. It seems a bit counterintuitive given their overall push for decentralization.
Right. If they want to give more power to the states, why are they talking about giving more power to tribes?
It's interesting, isn't it? There are a few ways to interpret this. Some folks think they see tribal governments as more aligned with their vision of limited government, like they're natural allies in this fight against federal overreach.
Hmm. That's an interesting take. So more like the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of situation.
Maybe, yeah. But it also could be a way to appeal to Native American voters. It's hard to say for sure what their motivations are.
Okay, so there might be some political strategy at play, but what would this actually look like in practice? Would tribes have more say in environmental decisions that affect their lands and communities?
That's the idea. They specifically propose elevating the American Indian Office to a full assistant administrator position within the EPA.
So giving them a more direct line to the top?
Exactly. It would give tribes a stronger voice in policy decisions and more influence over how environmental laws are implemented on their lands.
Wow, that's a pretty significant change. So they want less federal control overall, but they're willing to centralize power when it comes to tribal governments. That's fascinating.
It is, and it reflects the complex relationship between the federal government, states, and tribal nations, especially when it comes to issues like environmental justice and the protection of sacred lands.
Right, those are issues that have been historically overlooked and marginalized.
Exactly. So this proposal is interesting because it acknowledges the unique role of tribal governments in environmental protection. But it also raises questions about how it would actually work in practice.
Yeah, like how would this increased tribal authority interact with state authority? Would there be conflicts?
That's a good question. And it's one that the document doesn't really address in detail, so there's definitely some ambiguity there.
Okay, so we've covered states' rights, the role of science, the unique situation with tribal governments. What else is on their agenda?
Well, they also spend a lot of time talking about the legal landscape surrounding all these potential changes.
Right, because any changes they make would have to hold up in court, right?
Exactly. And they're clearly aware of that.
Hmm.
They even seem to be anticipating a lot of legal challenges.
So they're not just thinking about policy, they're thinking about legal strategy as well.
Absolutely. They're playing the long game, trying to figure out how to make their vision legally bulletproof.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So what kind of legal challenges do they foresee?
Well, one thing they emphasize is the need for a one-voice approach to legal interpretation within the EPA.
One voice. Huh. What does that mean?
They basically want to make sure everyone within the EPA is on the same page when it comes to interpreting environmental laws.
So no more conflicting opinions from different departments.
Right. They're worried that those kinds of conflicts could create confusion and weaken their ability to implement their vision.
I can see how that would be a problem. If different parts of the EPA are saying different things about the same law, it just creates opportunities for lawsuits and delays.
Exactly. And they're particularly focused on the role of the Supreme Court in all of this.
Right, because the Supreme Court has the final say on whether a law is constitutional or not.
Yep. And in recent years, the court has become more skeptical of the EPA's authority.
Like with that case a while back, West Virginia v. EPA. That one limited the EPA's power to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants.
Exactly. That was a major setback for environmentalists, and it signaled a shift in the court's thinking about the EPA's reach.
So this document is written with that context in mind. They know that any changes they make could end up being challenged in court, and they're trying to be prepared for that.
They're playing chess, not checkers, trying to anticipate their opponent's moves and plan accordingly.
That's a great analogy, and the stakes are high. The future of environmental protection in America could depend on how these legal battles play out.
It's a fascinating and crucial time for environmental law. This document really highlights that.
For sure, this whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener, and we've only just scratched the surface.
There's always more to explore. But hopefully, we've given our listeners a good overview of this conservative vision for the EPA.
I agree. And now, it's up to them to decide what they think about it all. Do they agree with this vision? Do they think it's the right direction for the EPA?
There are no easy answers, that's for sure. But this document forces us to grapple with some really important questions about the role of government, the use of science, and the future of our planet.
Well said. It's a conversation we need to be having. So, we've spent a lot of time unpacking this Project 2025 document, and it's safe to say it's pretty thought-provoking.
It really is. And let's be real, it's also pretty controversial.
For sure. I mean, we're talking about potentially reshaping the entire EPA.
Exactly, and that's not something to take lightly. The EPA affects so much of our lives, from the air we breathe to the water we drink.
Right, and this document lays out a vision for the agency that's drastically different from what we have now.
It's like they're looking at the EPA and saying, okay, let's rethink this whole thing from the ground up.
Yeah, it's a pretty radical departure from the status quo, and it raises a ton of questions.
Absolutely. Like, what's the right balance between protecting the environment and promoting economic growth?
That's the big one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can we have both? Or do we have to choose one over the other?
And who should be making those decisions? The federal government, the states, scientists, the public.
So many questions and no easy answers. But this document forces us to confront those questions head on.
It does. And it makes us think about what kind of future we want for our environment.
Imagine a world where each state sets its own environmental standards.
That's what they're proposing, yeah. More power to the states, less power to the federal government.
But wouldn't that just lead to a patchwork of regulations? Some states might have really strong protections, while others might prioritize business interests over the environment.
It's a real possibility. And it raises concerns about environmental justice.
Right, like will communities that are already disproportionately affected by pollution end up even worse off?
It's a valid concern, and it's something that needs to be carefully considered.
And then there's the whole question of science. This document is pretty skeptical of the precautionary principle, the idea that we should err on the side of caution when it comes to potential environmental risks.
Yeah, they argue that the EPA is too quick to regulate things, even if the scientific evidence isn't totally clear-cut.
But isn't it better to be safe than sorry? Especially when we're talking about things that could have long-term impacts on public health.
That's the debate, isn't it? How much risk are we willing to tolerate? And how much uncertainty is acceptable when it comes to scientific evidence?
Tough questions. And this document doesn't shy away from those tough questions. It really challenges us to rethink how we approach environmental protection.
It does. And it reminds us that these aren't just abstract policy debates. They have real consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely. The decisions we make today about the environment will have ripple effects for generations to come.
And those decisions are being made in a rapidly changing legal landscape. We've already seen the Supreme Court limit the EPA's authority in recent years, and that trend could continue.
Right, which is why this document is so interesting. It's clearly written with those legal challenges in mind.
They're not just thinking about policy, they're thinking about legal strategy. They're trying to figure out how to achieve their goals within the current legal framework.
So it's a game of chess, essentially.
You could say that, yeah. And the stakes are incredibly high.
This whole deep dive has been a wild ride. We've explored so many different aspects of this conservative vision for the EPA, from states' rights to scientific uncertainty to legal strategy.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
But hopefully we've given our listeners enough information to start forming their own opinions.
That's the goal, right? To spark a conversation, to get people thinking critically about these important issues.
Because ultimately, the future of our environment is in our hands. We all have a role to play in shaping that future.
Absolutely. So what do you think, listeners? Where do you stand on all of this?
Do you agree with this vision for the EPA? Or do you think we need to take a different approach?
There's no right or wrong answer, but it's a conversation we need to have as a society.
Well said. And we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and stay engaged in the fight for a healthier planet.